Let me start this video off by asking you a question. To you, what makes the world that Skyrim offers so much fun to explore? There are many correct answers to this hard question, but to me, it's the unique weapons and armor that can be found all over the map that makes this game super entertaining. These weapons can offer such a unique experience that may completely change how you play the game. Now, these unique weapons are vastly different from one another, but one thing is for certain: some of these weapons are way better than others. That is what we're going to explore in this video, at least for the one-handed weapons anyways. I'm only ranking the one-handed weapons in this video for convenience for those who have a one-handed weapons build, and for people who want to explore this style of combat. I will be making more videos to cover the rest of the unique weapons later on, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Now, just for clarification, a unique weapon is any weapon in the game that can only be found or acquired once. It may have a unique name, enchantment, or often both. We will be ranking these unique weapons on the usual factors, such as damage output, versatility, utility, and overall usefulness. We will not be covering some weapons in the video because they're either impossible to get without console commands, or they're temporary for quests, or they're just too weak to really talk about. So, here's a list of all those weapons on your screen right now. We will also not be looking at any Creation Club items in this list, mainly because they're really overpowered and it would ruin the list in my opinion. That's pretty much all to talk about before the ranking, so without further ado, let's get right into this. At number 30 we have the Poachers Axe. The Poachers Axe has a base damage of 5 and it does 3 extra damage to animals. Now, pretty much any other weapon you pick up will be more effective to both animals and other enemies in the game. Now, the only thing that's actually cool about this weapon is that it is the only one-handed woodcutter's axe in the entire game. So for collectors, it might be worth grabbing, but for everyone else, just pass on it. Sitting at number 29 is Bloodthorn. Bloodthorn is a unique steel dagger that does a base damage of 6, and it soul traps the enemy for 3 seconds. Basically, no part of this weapon at all is impressive. The damage is really low. You're going to find better weapons an hour into your playthrough, and the soul trap is whatever. It's not a unique enchantment. It's pretty easy to get. Plus, there's also a spell if you want to use that instead. Overall, Bloodthorn is just terrible. A lot of other weapons on this list overshadow it, and it should be completely avoided in almost every playthrough. At number 28, we have a certain pop culture reference, the notched pickaxe. If you think you know what the reference is, go ahead and drop it in the comments below. I'm curious to see how many of you guys know what the reference is from this weapon. The notched pickaxe does 5 base damage, and it does an additional 5 damage of shock. This weapon will also raise your smithing skill by 5 points when it is equipped. The low DPS on this weapon makes it unusable in most fights, and the other enchantment isn't very good too. In a world where we have fortified smithing enchantments and potions, 5 extra points of smithing doesn't really do a whole lot in the long run. This weapon can be found at the very top of the world for those who are really into the reference, but for those who aren't, it's not really worth getting. At number 27 we have Valdir's Lucky Dagger. Valdir's Lucky Dagger has a base damage of 6 and has a 25% chance to critical hit. Now that might sound great, but critical hits in Skyrim are actually quite bad. Basically, when a weapon gets a critical hit, it adds 1.5 times the base damage to that original hit. So basically what the weapon description should say is that it has a 25% chance to deal 8 additional damage. So that's not really great when you can have other enchantments that are guaranteed on every single hit and do more damage. I can see this weapon being used as an early game weapon until you find better stuff, but you will find a lot of better options as you get further in your playthroughs. At number 26 we have Horspan. Horspan does 200% extra damage to Horkers and nothing else. It has a regular base damage of 10, just like every other steel mace, but it's especially effective against Horkers. This is interesting because Horkers aren't the rarest enemy in the game, but they have a lot of health, so it may help you with that. However, by the time you find this weapon in Solstheim, you're likely going to have way better options to use against Horkers than Horspan. But it's still a really interesting and fun weapon. So yeah, this weapon has no versatility at all, but against Horkers, it is one of the best options in the entire game. At number 25, we have Ghostblade. Ghostblade has a measly base damage of only 8, and it does 3 extra points of damage that ignores armor. Basically, most enchants in the game that deal damage already ignore armor, so I don't really see the point here. Also, you can use something like the Mark for Death Shout if you are struggling with armor enemies. Overall, Ghostblade can be useful against these type of enemies, but there are just so many better options that you're going to have at your disposal, and the damage output is terrible. 8 damage for a sword is awful. I'm pretty sure a steel sword does more damage than that. At number 24, we have Red Eagle's Fury. Red Eagle's Fury has a base damage of only 8, and it deals 5 extra fire damage. Because of its enchantment, it is slightly better than Ghostblade because, well, 5 is greater than 3. It isn't really viable in most fights. It does have a fire enchantment though, so it can be useful against some enemies that are weak to fire, such as trolls or something like that. But even then, there are way better options on this list to deal with enemies like those. So, only slightly better than Ghostblade, but still not a great weapon overall. At number 23, we have the Blade of Sacrifice. The Blade of Sacrifice has a base damage of 10. There's not really much else to talk about this weapon. It's only a base dagger, no cool enchantments or anything like that. But it does do a decent amount of damage, so it is worth mentioning on this list. Overall, it's a solid dagger for most fights, but there are definitely ones that are better in the game. At number 22, we have the Aviri Sword. I think that's how you pronounce it anyways, I don't really know. But it does a base damage of 11 and no other special effects, just like the Blade of Sacrifice. Overall, it's a decent sword that will hold its own in many fights, but like I said, with Blade of Sacrifice, there are a ton of better options out there. But again, still a solid sword. At number 21, we have the Red Eagle's Bane, not to be confused with its brother, Red Eagle's Fury. Red Eagle's Bane does a base damage of 11, and it sets undead enemies up to level 13 on fire, and it makes them flee for 30 seconds. Red Eagle's Bane is actually a pretty solid weapon in the early game. It's nice that undead enemies are already weak to fire anyways, so lighting them ablaze is a pretty good effect. However, this weapon basically stops working after you hit level 13, since enemies scale with you. So once you hit over that level 13 mark, this weapon stops working against undead enemies. Again, in this clip, I'm actually hitting non-undead enemies and lighting them on fire, so I think it's a bug. But still, the fear effect won't work after level 13 against most enemies that are undead. So, yeah. It's an okay weapon because of its base damage, but even then, it's still not the best in the game. Not even close. At number 20 on the list, we have Harkin Sword. Harkin Sword does a base damage of 8, and it has a pretty unique enchantment. It absorbs 15 points of health, stamina, and magicka from the enemy, but you need to be a vampire for that effect to work. If you're not a vampire, this weapon is total garbage. 8 base damage is nothing. However, if you do plan to run a vampire build, or you're running one right now, Harkin Sword is a must grab. It has a powerful enchantment, but even as a vampire, it's still held back by its low base damage. I don't really enjoy vampire builds, but if I did, I would definitely go and pick up Harkin Sword. At number 19, we have Bowler's Oathblade. Bowler's Oathblade does a base damage of 11, and its enchantment deals 25 points of stamina damage, and creatures and people up to level 12 flee from combat. Basically, to sum it all up, this weapon is just boring. Stamina damage is not that helpful in Skyrim. Most enemies only use 1 or maybe even 2 power attacks, and so it's not very useful when you're engaged in a fight. It might help them from block bashing, but again, they don't do it that often, so it's not going to help that much. The fear enchantment on this weapon is okay, but again, it stops being useful once enemies get above level 12. If you ever need stamina damage, then this is the weapon to get. But other than that, it's just mediocre. Crash landing into number 18 is Oaken. Oaken has a base damage of 12, and it has a frost enchantment too for 10 points of damage. Remember, it does have a slower swing speed because it's an axe, so keep that in mind when you're dealing with the numbers. Oaken is a great weapon. The frost damage is great, does 10 points of damage to health and stamina, and it slows enemies down. And it overall has a pretty solid base damage, and it pairs well with its brother, which you will see next. Oaken is a decent weapon, viable in many fights. It does get overshadowed though by a lot of other weapons on this list. At number 17 we have Eduge, or Eduge. I know I'm butchering names today, but we're going to roll with it. Eduge has a base damage of 11, and it deals 10 points of damage to health and stamina. Just like Oaken, it's an okay weapon. You're going to get through fights and stuff with it, but like I said, it's going to be overshadowed by many other weapons on this list. The frost damage is nice though, being able to slow down your enemies, but besides that, not too much else to it. It's a pretty basic weapon. At number 16 we have Herbans Courage. Another weapon with 11 base damage, except it has a much better enchantment than all the other ones we've talked about on this list. The enchantment on this weapon makes it deal an additional whopping 25 points of fire damage, making it one of the strongest fire damage dealing weapons in the entire game. Herbans Courage is great against enemies like frost trolls, ice wolves, undead, vampires, stuff like that. Anything that's weak to fire will absolutely melt, get it, because of this weapon. That's all to really say about this weapon though. If it's not charged up, this weapon is average at best. It's held back a lot by its base damage, but it's still a good weapon to bring around for those times where you absolutely need fire damage. At number 15 we have the Pale Blade. The Pale Blade does a base damage of 11, and it deals 25 points of frost damage to health and stamina, and people and creatures up to level 16 will flee. Let's break this weapon down by starting with the Fear effect. Like I said on the other entries on this list, the Fear effect is only good in the early to middle game because of its level cap. Once you get over that level cap, you'll start seeing enemies that are higher than that level, and in this case it's level 16, which is somewhat early in the game. The one other thing I can really say about this weapon is that the frost damage can be resisted by a lot of enemies in this game, such as Nords, vampires, any undead, any frost animal, or anything like that. So you do have that to worry about. But other than that, it's a solid option across the board. At number 14, we have the Galder Blackblade. The Galder Blackblade has a base damage of 11, and it will also absorb 25 points of health with this enchantment. 25 absorbed health is significant, especially on a sword that is swinging fast, so you'll be able to get that enchantment stacked over and over and over again, and you'll be a lot more tanky. The base damage is what holds this weapon back, just like a lot of other weapons around this area of the list, but its enchantment is so good, and I think it's a must grab for most players. At the number 13 spot on this list, we have Dawnbreaker. Dawnbreaker deals a base damage of 12, and its enchantment burns the target for 10 seconds. If you manage to defeat an undead enemy with Dawnbreaker, it has a small chance of causing an explosion, dealing a lot of damage to other enemies around it, and giving them the Fear effect. This enchantment makes this weapon excellent against any sort of undead enemies in the game, and its base damage and fire enchantment makes it a decent option for even non-undead enemies. Dawnbreaker is a good weapon, but it's a little too specialized for my taste. At number 12, we have a weapon I can't really say the name of out loud because I don't want YouTube to strike me down. So we're going to call it H-Frost. H-Frost has a base damage of 5, and it has a pretty cool enchantment, dealing 15 points of frost damage to health and stamina, and having a chance of freezing the enemy solid. We'll start off with the bad parts about this weapon first. First of all, this weapon is not very good on its own. Sure, the frost enchantment is nice, but it only has a base damage of 5, which means it won't really scale up once you get high in level and you start dealing with tougher enemies. However, this weapon is perfect to pair up with any other weapon or spell that deals a high amount of damage. This is because you can freeze an enemy, then you can absolutely wail on them with a different spell, weapon, or anything else of your choice. It also has the utility of being an ancient Nordic pickaxe, which might be helpful in your adventures. Overall, H-Frost is a great tool that fits a lot with other playstyles. At number 11, we have Keening. Keening has a base damage of 8, and its enchantment absorbs 10 points of all 3 stats. This weapon may look like it's pretty underwhelming, but I think it's one of the better daggers in the game. First of all, it does not need to be charged by a soul gem, meaning that you'll be always absorbing stamina and health to help you in any fight. The Magicka is also good if you like to use a mage playstyle, and since you don't have to charge it, it's always going to be available. The second thing here to note is that the dagger has a fast attack speed, meaning you'll be absorbing more health and stamina than any other weapon on this list besides like the Blade of Woe, which also has absorbed health. So that's also something to consider, that you will be getting a lot more of those stats because you're going to be swinging more often. While the low attack damage on this weapon may seem like an issue, I believe that Keening is a solid dagger. Not my first choice by any means, but it's definitely worthy of some recognition. Just barely making it into the top 10 is Dragon Bane. Dragon Bane does a base damage of 14, and it does a whopping 40 extra points of damage to dragons, while also doing 10 points of damage to everything else. While this weapon might seem very situational, and it is, this weapon has helped me out so much in legendary difficulty, where dragons are nearly impossible to kill early on in the game. It is a good weapon too, the base damage is high, the enchantment also deals 10 points of damage to everything else, so this weapon is useful outside of the scenarios where you are fighting dragons. This weapon is a must pick up for any players struggling with dragons. Sliding into the number 9 spot is Soul Render. Soul Render deals a base damage of 13, and it has a pretty unique enchantment. Only if you have Blood Scythe in your other hand, Soul Render will absorb 15 magicka from your opponents, and it will dispel any magical defenses that your opponents may have summoned. This could be something like wards, or like oak flesh, or even healing spells will even be dispelled with this weapon. Overall, Soul Render is a decent weapon and has a good base damage. Its enchantment is pretty cool and helpful against mages, however it is bound to Blood Scythe, so if you don't use Blood Scythe too, this weapon is pretty bad actually. At number 8 is another scimitar named Wind Shear. Wind Shear is a very unique weapon. Basically what it does is, when you block bash someone, it has a small chance to knock the enemy over. This of course allows you to get a lot of damage in once they're down on the ground, and through the animation when they try to get back up. Overall, Wind Shear is a great weapon, however it does have a few downsides that need to be discussed. First of all, it has a base damage of only 11, which is much lower than some of these other weapons on this list. To use this enchantment correctly, you can't have an item in your offhand. This is because you can't block bash with an item in your other hand. So Wind Shear might not be compatible with other playstyles that require you to have a shield or another sword or something in your offhand, because you can't actually use the enchantment with something else in your other hand. Wind Shear is a powerful weapon with a pretty cool enchantment. It also helps that you don't have to charge it up with soul gems, which is a pretty nice bonus. At number 7 is the Mace of Molag Ball. The Mace of Molag Ball does a total of 16 base damage. However, it does swing slower like a mace, so just be aware of that. It also deals 25 points to stamina and to magicka, and it has a 3-second soul trap effect, which is pretty solid. This mace is reliable. It's great against mages that require a lot of magicka to fight you with, so it's good to take that away from them. And the base damage is great. It does about as much damage as a Daedric mace, and so you're getting a lot of value when you use the Mace of Molag Ball. Plus, it has soul trap on it too, which is nice. Sliding into the number 6 spot, we have Maron Razor, dealing a total of 11 base damage and having one of the most unique enchantments in the entire game. Maron Razor is definitely one of the more notable weapons in the entire game. While being a decent dagger all around, even without the enchantment, Maron Razor is really only notable because of its enchantment. It has a small chance to insta-kill enemies, and I did a little bit of research on it. Apparently it's like a 2% chance that this effect occurs per hit, so it's not as reliable as I want it to be. It's only going to work on some enemies and not others, and that really sucks. However, you can really cheese through any non-major boss fight in the entire game by quick saving and loading until you get that effect to occur. So overall, it's a great weapon, great dagger, an awesome enchantment, but it's just not as reliable as I want it to be. Just barely cracking into the top 5 is Blood Scythe. Blood Scythe does a total of 13 base damage, and it has one of the more unique enchantments in the entire game. When wielded with Soul Render, this weapon will absorb 15 health and has a chance to lower the target's armor. Now, again, like the enchantment says, Blood Scythe can really only be useful when you have Soul Render in your other hand. That limits its versatility a ton. However, the weapon's enchantment makes up for it a lot. 15 absorbed health is nothing to scoff at, and the weakened enemy armor part is so good, and it'll win you so many fights. However, it does do a lower base damage than some of these other top weapons, and looking back now, I might have ranked this weapon way too high. Let me know what you think about Blood Scythe and Soul Render down in the comments below. I'm really interested to see what you guys think about this duo of weapons. Chillen at number 4 is Aviri Sword. This sword is of course obtained by slaying Mirak at the end of the Dragonborn DLC. This sword actually has the highest base damage out of the entire list, with a base damage of 16. That is one of the main reasons why Aviri Sword is so high up on the list, because swords are meant to do damage, and well, this one does do the most. The enchantment on Aviri Sword is not half bad either, absorbing 15 points of stamina per hit. This of course allows for infinite power attacks. The one downside to this weapon is that the enchantment is a little bit bland. It just only absorbs stamina and that's it, and a lot of other weapons on this list have a lot more exciting enchantments that will provide different bonuses in different fights. However, Aviri Sword will still be one of the best options for most fights in the entire game. Don't skip out on this weapon. Just barely making it onto the podium is Chillen. Chillen has a base damage of 15, does 30 points of frost damage, and has a chance to paralyze the target for 2 seconds. First of all, 30 frost damage is absolutely insane. It does so much damage to health and stamina, and also the 2 seconds of paralyze makes such a difference in every single fight I use this weapon in. You might be thinking that 2 seconds of paralyze doesn't really do a whole lot. However, the enemies will have to go through the animation of falling down and then getting back up, and that's just such a big window of opportunity that you can get so much damage in. It's frankly one of the best effects in the entire game, and it's an enchantment on a weapon with a high base damage with a very heavy enchantment too. Chillen is definitely worth grabbing down in Mercer Frey's hideout. Taking the silver medal on this list is none other than the Blade of Woe. The Blade of Woe is a dagger given to you at the end of the Dark Brotherhood questline. It does 12 points of base damage, and it does an additional 10 points of absorbed health. The Blade of Woe is widely considered by many people, and me, to be the best dagger in the entire game. The base damage of the Blade of Woe rivals that of a Dragonbone dagger, and its enchantment is so reliable and so nice that it easily makes the Blade of Woe one of the best weapons in the entire game. Additionally, the fast swing speed of the Blade of Woe allows you to stack so many absorbed health enchantments one by one after another, so that you'll basically be a lot more tanky in most fights. The Blade of Woe is a basic essential for any assassin characters that you make in Skyrim. At the number 1 spot on our list, we have the Nightingale Blade. The Nightingale Blade does a total of 14 base damage, and it absorbs 25 points of health and 25 points of stamina. This weapon will do so much work against most enemies in the game. It has a fast swing speed, so you'll be absorbing so much health and so much stamina, you'll never die, you'll have infinite power attacks, and it does a lot of regular base damage too. It is without a doubt the most reliable and versatile weapon on this list, so long as you have the soul gems to charge it. It does consume a lot, to be honest. However, even with that small downside, there's no doubt that the Nightingale Blade is the best, unique, one-handed weapon in all of Skyrim. I like to end off my videos by talking about my favorites. My favorite one is definitely the Blade of Woe. I think the coolest looking one is definitely the Mace of Molag Ball. And the one that confuses me the most is Horspan. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked the video, please consider liking or subscribing. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.